Your thing.
Hello, BookTube. Hello, BookTube. I've got a guest here once again. It's Saturday. This is Zach from the Brattle Bookshop in Boston. It's Zacher Day.
Yeah, no, that's
No.
no.
And we're going to discuss today a subject that's been haunting our last couple of Zoom discussions, which is the pernicious effect of sabermetrics on the sport of professional baseball. No, once again, it's a bait.
You're gonna cry wolf every time until
once again, we are not going to do that. Instead, we're going to talk about a subject that, if anything, is even nearer and dearer to Zach's heart than Russian literature. And that is the antiquarian book sale, the trade that you have entered into.
That's right.
So I thought first we should give new viewers an idea of the Brattle, since that's the way by which you did them, right? It's unlikely that you would be so far enmeshed in the world of antiquarian bookselling if not for the Brattle.
Oh, almost, yeah, almost impossible.
So I mean, viewers on my channel know that it's a great used bookstore in Boston, but it's an old used bookstore. You have its spiel down pat, don't you?
Well, it is certainly an old used bookstore in Boston, although I'll add used in rare books, because that's another part of it, although one that your viewers probably don't get as much of a perspective on. But it was founded in Boston in 1825, and it's been in existence, open somewhere in the city since then. Now, the current iteration started in 1949 when the current owner, Ken Gloss's parents, bought the shop. So essentially, this version of the Brattle Bookshop started in 1949 when the Gloss family took over.
The Brattle is, it's an active retail concern.
Yes,
antiquarian bookstore, and people might have the idea of two old gentlemen in tweed vests who have one customer a week. The Brattle's not like that. It's I try to convey that anyway. It's a corrida. It's a rodeo.
yeah, that's right.
Retail concern. And as a result,
that image of the antiquarian bookshop, for several reasons, is pretty antiquated at this point. To say that I think I can safely say that it more or less does not exist, because a shop that there's certainly book businesses that operate that way, but to have an open shop at this point with certainly the way bookselling has been going, the way retail real estate, business real estate has gone in the country, you have to be a pretty vibrant retail concern to exist.
An absolute godsend in that regard that the Brattle owns the building.
Oh, it's the most important factor in the business.
Yeah. But so since the Brattle is a booming retail concern, they are constantly overturning staff, as I know. Yes. I have known many generations of Brattle.
Although I'd say for most, compared to most retail businesses, we have comparatively low turnover. We'll hire seasonal staff mostly for the summer, but for the most part, the people who are working here now have been working here for at least a year plus, and several for multiple years.
And in your case,
since the Reagan since
what my Irish viewers would say is donkey years.
Yeah, that's right. So,
but once upon a time, you were a fresh-faced muling newt of a new hire,
and that was the summer of 2006.
So when you were that muling, fresh-faced new newt of a hire, dealing with buys and weird customers
that only get weirder.
Well, you do get some of those, I've heard anyway. When you were that new newt of a bookseller, was there any thought in your head of the antiquarian book trade as
no, not in any way that my job has evolved now. I knew I liked books. More or less every job I'd ever had um, had been selling books or promoting books in some way. So I knew I wanted to work under that general umbrella. But no, I had no idea that it would turn into a career.
Well, there had to be some sort of allure, right? There are plenty of people who work at the Brattle and don't go that route. What was the allure? What was it that drew you to the idea of, well,
I
and for that matter, what would we describe the idea as?
Sure. Well, it can, I think it's a lot of different ideas for different people. You'll talk to booksellers and you'll get as many different answers as you have people. But I think one thing that you'll find constant is just, I like to learn things. I like to try and know as much as I can about something. But I'm also really attracted to subjects that I can never know everything about or even approach knowing everything about. And I don't know a better subject than books with that goal in mind.
It's an intensely human subject, isn't it? You
Oh,
delve
absolutely.
into any individual edition of a book within seconds. You're talking about someone's idiosyncratic life.
That's right.
It might not be quite so true with, for instance, the archaeology of major urban temples. I mean, individual people built and designed those things, but they very seldom put their own print on it in the way that you'll get with used books all the time, with antiquarian books all the time.
All the time.
So when did it, do you remember the experience of when it changed from dabbling to a serious interest, something that might be a part of your life in the future?
That's a really good question.
Was there a distinct point or
I don't know if there was a single point, but I can think of a few sort of mileposts, I guess, where the idea sort of emerged. Oh, this is something I'd really like to do. Oh, this is something I actually can do if I work at some specific things. One particular thing I'll mention, and I'll be darned if I can remember what year this was, but I'm going to guess I had been working at the shop for a couple, 3 years. So let's call it 2009. And in that summer, the shop acquired what we knew to be an orderly book from some unit of a Revolutionary War of the colonial army. And we didn't know much more about that. And I have a pretty good, or even then, I had a pretty good instinct for historical handwriting, just being able to read different hands. I had no specific training in it, but I had a knack for it. So I took that. It was a big journal about probably, I think if I remember, 150 or so pages, and started to transcribe it and see what it was. And eventually transcribing the whole thing, there was enough information to determine which unit it was, that it was a regiment, and not one of the smaller units. I was able to do some research and identify which regiment it was, and place it right here, actually, going back and forth between Boston and Cambridge during the Siege of Boston in 1775. And the process of doing that, it's insanely cool to have something that Washington read, like, or at least was used to convey information to Washington when his headquarters were across the river in Cambridge. That's just insanely cool. you get. I'm not somebody who gets tingles up the back of my spine, but I definitely felt something with that. But also just the fact that I could do it, that I had the patience with that kind of work, which is drudgery. It's not exciting. This is not Nicolas Cage, busting into into through locked doors and rescuing artifacts. This is, trying to, looking over something for an hour, trying to decide if it's a D or if it's a long S. It's really drudge work to get to the 15 or so passages in a document like that really open it up, that tell you what it is, why it's important, and where it fits in the historical record.
So there's a satisfying element of detection.
Yeah, usually there is. Sometimes it's entirely fruitless, but usually there's some there's some conclusions that you can come
to hunker down on that specific example just for the moment. I do have more questions. I have more chronological questions. Sorry to ask about, was there one inciting incident? I'm a lifelong superhero comic book fan. So
I've heard
origin story.
Yeah.
You were bitten by a radioactive card catalog or something like that. So I'm perfectly happy to adapt that to, an adult discussion frame where there'll be many inciting incidents. But if we hunker down on that example just for the moment, to give viewers a little glimpse inside the antiquarian book trade, you get a thing like that, an orderly book that, as you say, someone would have read to George Washington. And you've done the legwork and figured out its provenance, right? That's what you're talking about, is that you figured out, as close as it could be figured out, where it came from. Who wrote it?
Well, where it came from, but also, what it was. You could tell that it was an orderly book, but there were lots of orderly books. All regiments and smaller units had them. It was one of the main methods of communication for the army at that time, but also to pinpoint it to a specific regiment, which turned out to be a Connecticut regiment, to identify the colonel and some of the officers in that. You can really you can know exactly where they were encamped and how they participated.
So
it really does, it turns something that's sort of obviously an important thing, but a curiosity into something that really adds to the historical record.
Okay, well that comes directly to my follow-up questions about this particular thing.
Yeah.
In the antiquarian book world, a shop gets a thing like that.
Yeah.
Does the research that you did in order to put it in the historical record.
Yes.
What, if anything, is then the shop's professional ethics involving an item like that? It's an item that museums would want to have.
Yes.
So is there a sense in which museums would have to just line up with anybody else to bid for it?
Well, in this case, I can go into some general specifics, but in this one, once I did all of the work and cataloged it, we got in touch with with a colleague who deals specifically in historical Americana, and with them offered it to a major institution, to an institutional library at a price, and they agreed to buy it.
Okay, but in a circumstance like that, would the intermediated offer to an institution of some kind be a preference? Or
yeah, well, and I see what you're asking.
I mean,
is
what
it
if,
just
what if you knew of a wealthy collector out there, one individual crackpot who was collecting orderly?
Yes. Well, and you bring this touches on a point that I think a lot of people miss, the difference between institutional collectors, museums, cultural institutions, and private collectors. That there would be sort of a moral preference for the institution. And in one sense, that's true. And I think in a lot of cases, that would be my personal preference. But I also think that sort of devalues the really important contribution that individual collectors have throughout history and still do now to preserve that record too. If you think about it, you know, a lot of the manuscripts, let's take, for example, your favorite book, The Metamorphosis of Ovid. If you think about a contemporary manuscript of Metamorphosis, so what are we talking, the 1st or 2nd century Common Era? Is that when it was written? There was no Houghton Library at Harvard University then to preserve these. Certainly the odd government would make a point of doing it. But really, from then until you start, you know, with the Middle Ages and sort of monasteries taking that up, it's all private collectors, private ownership that preserve.
Okay, but they're not doing it to preserve the book. They're doing it to have a copy. It's accident that they preserve the book by doing that.
I think that's a little more cynical than I would.
What contributions do modern day book collectors, private book collectors, make to the collective knowledge that isn't made by prying their manuscripts?
See, that's something that I will say. I've known a number of private collectors who will publish manuscripts like that, who will make that available.
Really?
It's in their collection, but they'll go to the expense to put out an edition of it so that it's accessible.
So in the case of the Orderly book, if there were, you know,
so for instance, to circle back around, if we did have a strong relationship with a private collector, that would be a consideration. And I understand framing it as sort of a moral decision. And I think my personal preference would be to try to get it into an institution. But I also don't think it would be morally negligent to offer it first to a collector. It all depends on the collector. But collectors also, institutions are constrained as well. Institutions can't retain everything they want to. Institutions are constrained by budgetary concerns.
And just to stick with the Orderly book, or an example like that, something like that would only come to you from a non-collector, right? The only way that an item like that would ever come to your pricing table would be if the person didn't know what they had. Is that right?
No. In this case, the person had a sense of what it was. They knew it was an Orderly book. They knew it had been in their family for quite some time.
Oh, no kidding. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it had a strong provenance. It wasn't looted from a historical society somewhere. Well, these are the very real questions that we have to have to deal with, especially with objects like this.
Yeah.
That we're talking about.
Oh, if somebody steals a single illuminated page from a museum, from a precious book collection in California, and it turns up on the market in New York. Yeah, you're ethically bound, I would imagine. But okay, so something like that coming to your shop, with a known or suspected provenance, so that the person knows there's something here. That's a very different thing from the kind of thing that I imagine a great many viewers are curious about, which is the treasures that just walk in off the street without the person knowing anything about them.
Yes.
That is the stereotypical image of a used or antiquarian bookstore. How true is that in your own experience? How often?
It's very true in that it does happen. It's probably not as true as it is vivid in people's imaginations, because much more often the opposite is the case. The opposite being someone brings something in that they think is wonderfully valuable and rare, and it's completely ordinary, or it's falling apart, and they think it's terribly old because it's 150 years old, and it's something that was published 200 years before that, and that version, that edition would be valuable, but this one is not.
I've heard the Brattle has gotten very good at letting those customers down easy. I've heard that spiel so many times over the day. You do it about as painlessly as it can be done.
Well, yeah, but it's important to do that because it's important to do that for a lot of reasons. One, a lot of times people have these images built up in their head, and you're sort of dashing their hopes, which happens to everybody, and it's never nice. So that's one reason we try to let them down easy. But also, at least I don't want to discourage people, because someone could bring in 10 things that are utter junk. And on the 11th thing, they could really have something. And if you discourage them after the first one, you're not seeing the next 10.
I've often heard you say to customers over the years, it's a very good book. You could very much enjoy it, but it's not financially valuable.
Yeah.
And that seems to work.
And that's an important distinction to make for people too, whether they be in the shop or, for instance, if I'm making a house call and dealing with someone's estate, or the estate of a loved one. Sometimes my job feels, my wife, who is an actual professional nurse practitioner and social worker, gets angry when I say this, but some of my job ends up being something kind of like social work in a sense, because a lot of times you're coming into a situation where family members have to deal with a loved one's estate. And I don't know about you, Steve, but when my time comes, probably the most intimate personal expression of who I was as a person that has a physical representation left is going to be my books.
Well, I'm only 28, so I don't have to worry about that for quite some time.
Long time in the future.
But where that came from. Yes, sooner or later, somewhere down the line, someone's going to have to deal with my porn, but not for a long time.
Well, someone's going to have to find where it's hidden behind all of the all of your clever misdirection.
I swear, I read Dog Fancy for the articles. But when you talk about making house calls, that brings up another subject that I imagine a lot of people have heard anecdotal stories about. And I've asked you this on many an occasion, where you go to a house. Let's say someone says, I've got 100 books. They've sent you pictures. You always encourage people to send pictures so you know whether or not it's a complete waste of time. If it's just a stack of Tom Clancy's, you can just say no. But where you go, you look at the 100 books and it's not going to set the world on fire. You can write them a check, but then you see over there, not part of the 100 books, a couple of things, or even one thing that you very much want, a thing where the offer would eclipse what you're getting for the whole of the stack that the person has selected. Right. Does that happen on a regular enough basis?
Yeah, that does happen. I wouldn't say a regular basis. Again, it's much less common than the other, but then where it's just sort of uninteresting material.
Experience? I've heard anecdotes from book people in this world, people who go out and do house calls and make buys of books. I've heard anecdotes about how they can see from a spine, from a corner, that it's instinct. Their instinct to hone to such a point that you can show them a wall of books and they'll zero in on one that could be something, and they'll often be right. Do you remember the feeling of accumulating those instincts, or did you have a lot of them already?
No, I think it is, and accumulation is the right term, because initially every person, and me in particular, I had the books that I came in interested in. So I knew what sort of the high points were in a couple fields. So I knew what I wanted to find. And so I think that was my entry point into broadening my base of knowledge to know what valuable books were in as many different areas as possible and as many different eras of printing as possible.
So for a viewer who might want to try this, Would you say that that is the right approach? Start with what interests you?
It worked with me. For instance, when I started working at the Brattle, I loved reading about the American Civil War. So I quickly learned, just because I was interested in what some high points, what some very valuable, rare books were in that field.
Like what?
eh,
I have lots of
oh,
Civil War fans here. What thing are
well,
we talking
it's certainly not rare, but one of the great antiquarian books is the memoirs of General Grant, which is an interesting sort of object lesson in 19th century publishing practices. But the one that people are usually familiar with, if they are familiar with that, is a two thick volumes, green cloth with the shoulder strap design.
Right.
So that's a sort
I swear I've seen that set at the shop.
Oh, we've had, I think I've probably sold 4 or 5 of them in the last year.
But you're saying there's a version, a variation.
There are several variations. So that book actually came out in, I think, 4 different bindings, the green cloth being by far the least expensive and most common one. There was also what I like to call government sheep, which is the binding that's, you often see government documents from that time bound in, which is sort of a light tan sheep leather binding. There was that, very fragile, almost impossible to find one of those in nice condition. But if you do, much more valuable than the cloth version. There was also a very decorative black Morocco leather with gilt stamping for those shoulder straps. A very decorative, attractive book. Very expensive if you find, or much more expensive compared to the green cloth. And there was also one that was, I think, advertised, and I've seen an advertisement for a contemporary advertisement for the book, where the customer could choose each of these options to buy in 1885, when it was when Charles Webster Company, Mark Twain's publishing enterprise, when they published it. But there was one in, I think they called it Turkey, which was just a differently processed leather that was in red. And I've only seen one set of those come through here.
And in a case like that, oh God, the countdown has started.
10 minutes.
Oh my. All right, well, we can do it. We can do this. In a case like that, that would be only a dedicated collector, right? I mean, a museum would only want, for instance, Grant.
Yeah, things like that. Like I said, there's a very important distinction between valuable and rare. And the Grant's Memoirs is not a rare book.
Right.
It might be unusual or difficult to find certain copies in certain conditions, but it's not rare.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with something like a first edition of The Great Gatsby.
Right.
Highly collectible, highly sought after, particularly if it has the dust jacket, but obtainable if you want to pay for it.
As opposed to
Post Tamerlane for some reason, or as opposed to Post Tamerlane, for instance, Edgar Allan Poe's first publication, published in Boston. I can't remember when the last one came up for auction, but it's not. It's one of those that another one will probably turn up at some point, but maybe not. That is a truly rare book. You cannot get one today.
A very small print, slim volume of poetry from someone who went on to become famous, but who's
it was basically Juvenilia that got published in Boston. I can't remember.
And how rarefied have the circles become for items like that? The chances of something like that being in the possession of someone who has no idea what it is are virtually nil.
Yeah, unless with something like that, it's small enough that it might have someone might not know they have it. It might be in the proverbial attic somewhere. But if someone has it and has seen it, they probably know what it is. But I've learned to say not necessarily a lot.
So antiquarian book dealers know each other.
Yes.
At book fairs, do they often do a lot of business with each other instead of the
that's where, for a lot of people, that's where the majority of the business is done before
Really?
the fair even opens.
And why would that be? Surely at the back of that somewhere is a buying customer.
One would hope.
Well, some antiquarian book dealers have the bug, right?
Yeah, well, that's also part of it. Yes, there is an end customer at some point for someone, but that doesn't mean that specialist dealers can't, buy from for instance, we're a general antiquarian bookshop. We don't specialize in a particular subject. So oftentimes what we price a book at, a specialist dealer who has very good customers in a specific area will be able to buy our copy and present it, recatalog it, present it to a customer at a higher price. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people, that's the bulk of their business, is buying from other dealers.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my. No, I can definitely attest to your general interest, because that behind the registers on the top shelf there, you've always got something collectible up there. Mm-hmm. And over the years, that you never know what's going to be
anything.
It could be anything. Okay, well,
one thing since we only have a couple more minutes, I just thought of a nice way.
We're being reminded in Russian that we only have a couple more minutes.
Speaking of Russian, one thing we can do to sort of tie up my arc here. So I mentioned in 2009 or so that orderly book. Flash forward to today, I'm expecting probably by Monday in the mail from a gentleman who I got in touch with, who got in touch with us in the middle of the country, who has, it was his grandmother's basically diary. She and her family escaped or emigrated from Russia in 1917. And this is her diary basically of 1917. And it chronicles her family leave. She was in her late teens at that point. And her family fled east and took the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Vladivostok, then a ship to Tokyo, and then a ship to Boston. And this is her account of the journey. And obviously, what's that?
Firsthand in manuscript. No one's ever
in manuscript. Oh yeah, her manuscript. Yeah, and this, and I've been working with this gentleman for the past several weeks. He sent me some photos so I could see, something of what it is, and it is what it sounds like. Luckily, her handwriting was good enough that, or was clear enough that I could decipher it. So this I'm awaiting, hopefully on Monday, to work with.
But a thing like that,
yeah.
Again, there has to be an end customer in mind, right? Or are you?
Well, and this is something that I absolutely will offer to an institution. But the reason I bring this up is, let's say, go back to 2009, and this manuscript, I guess I should say, is in Russian.
Hence your mention that you took time to verify it.
Yeah.
Okay.
In 2009, I didn't speak a word of Russian or Latin, which is another thing that I've acquired in the intervening 15 or so years. So my arc has been sort of getting interested, and then about that time realizing, if I really want to do this, there are some things I need to learn in a formal way. Language.
So you're saying that in the intervening years you got smarter?
I got more educated.
You've also done explicit education, right? There were summers where you abandoned me for some sort of seminar somewhere else.
there's a wonderful institution called Rare Book School that is at the University of Virginia.
Yeah,
where-
that's the
where
one. the
one
right
can
one.
specifically take week-long courses in descriptive bibliography, which I have in various aspects of book and printing history. It's an amazing institution, but that is another book-specific related educational path that I've.
I remember telling you when you told me that you were going to the first of those, I said, so you're trading a summer of me asking you every week where my glasses are for going to
You have glasses?
Virginia? You're going to trade that? And you seem to have no hesitation at all.
No, I didn't because I know you'll be here when I get back.
Well, all right, we've only got a couple of minutes left. Do you have any, this is a totally predictable question, but people are going to want to know, do you have any advice for somebody who might be thinking that the antiquarian book trade might be for them? Any way, for instance, a diagnostic for them to know whether or not that's true, that maybe that's crucially different from just being interested in old books?
No, I don't know. Certainly trying to get a job at an antiquarian shop, a general shop, of which there are a few these days, but
that would at least show you what you're getting into, right?
It would, and it's it's not just the work that we're talking about now. For instance, this morning I got here at 7:15 in the morning, and the first thing I did was unloaded 40 boxes of 40 35-pound boxes of books that Ken and I had bought yesterday from our truck and brought them down to the basement. So there's a lot that goes into being able to spend those hours with interesting material.
In order to spend time on the third floor, you have to spend time in the basement.
You absolutely do.
There's a phrase I heard a long time ago. Good
But
Lord.
it's actually,
I hadn't
what's that?
eviscerated my first book at 7:15.
well, one thing I'd say, there's a lot of, there's a great course called the Antiquarian Book Seminars. They're now in Minnesota. They used to be in Colorado, which is specifically sort of a book selling boot camp.
So people can Google that.
People can absolutely Google that. And if they get in touch with the shop, I'd be happy to provide them with
There you go.
Contact information.
We're out of time.
Okay.
You want to wave goodbye? we will reconvene next week.
We'll do this. Sounds great.
All
Have
right.
a good weekend, Steve.
You too.